Woodstock.
What was in Woodstock, of course.
Woodstock was the big thing. Other than that, I remember Glenn Campbell's song, Gentle on My Mind. Other than that, not much.
Right.
The whole emergence of rock and roll was huge, and television was there to capture a lot of it. Just recently we saw a whole thing on, I guess, was it the 50th anniversary of the Beatles being on the Ed Sullivan Show, and started in '64, I guess. I often recall looking back on a video, I think it was of maybe the Monterey Festival after Woodstock in California. The Stones were playing, and the Hells Angels are guarding the stage, and it appears that everyone is tripping on acid, and the hair, the sea change of the cultural change and the hippie movement. I think the counterculture influence has certainly had an influence on mainstream society and our social standards. I recall some of the early environmental Earth Day movement, Save the Planet types of things, and I wonder what happened to some of the counterculture movement and the call for revolution and things, and sometimes I wonder today with what we see of big corporations taking over control more and more, and having more influence, and the great divide into classes, great divide in income inequality. Where did some of our hippies go? Where's the call? But
two of our guys got into it, and joined the party, so to speak. And we went on. One guy said he was doing mushrooms, psilocybin, I guess, is what's in it or something. And the other guy was drunk and, I don't know if he had done cocaine or whatever, but...
Can't buy me love. I had 3 friends who skipped school and drove into New York and were at the airport when they arrived. Mm-hmm. And of course they could barely see or hear anything because they were so, but thousands and thousands of teenage girls especially showed up at the airport in New York and went bananas to the Beatles. I remember that. And in those days, there was on the radio, the Beatles literally had like the top 8 songs of the top 10. You have to understand, we had records and we had radio. There was no CD. There weren't even cassettes then. I mean, in the early '60s, mid '60s, that came later on. And you do your homework, and every single song would be a Beatles song. And then once in a while, there was another English group called the Animals. The Stones were just coming in, but they were sort of after the Beatles. Dave Clark 5. They were all English groups. And poor American singers were like, "Oh my God, we are toast here."
I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened. I didn't know you could have hair like that in the first place, But there was such an incredible exuberance and electricity about that whole thing, that I remember my parents and older people at the time would kind of giggle at it, and like they did about Elvis, and all the rest of us were like totally like mad about it, crazy for it, and thought, wow, who are these guys? This is the coolest thing ever. Yeah. As a musician, it was the most exciting time I can imagine, because everything was happening in music, not only pop music and rock and roll, but classical music and the avant-garde music that I was really into. And there were concerts every night, and composers were popping up all over the place, and it was the beginning of sort of electronic music, both serious and in pop music.
Talk to me about the JFK and MLK assassinations.
Certainly two big events in the history of the United States. I was at the Brooklyn Navy Yard doing an audit of the records at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And it came over the loudspeaker that the president was shot. So it was around 1 o'clock, 1:15 in the afternoon, I remember that. We were all dismissed. As I got to the subway, someone said that the president is dead.
Okay, I remember this so clearly because it was completely surreal. I was at school. I went to this very tiny school. And my first sense that everything went very still. Everything was very quiet. And I remember the librarian, who was also married to the headmaster, named Mrs. Pennypacker. And she came into the room and she said, school's going to end early. Your parents are going to come and pick you up. And that's sort of all she said. And I remember being, what is going on? This is so strange, because there was no radio playing. There was nothing on. But I remember all of a sudden cars starting to pull in front of the big building. It was the main school. And I remember people crying, adults crying, which was sort of unusual, picking your kids up from school. And it was but it was like everything was still, sort of like packed in cotton. It was this sense of things being quiet. And we got home, and by that time, my mom picked us up. We knew what had gone on, and it was like a massive shock. People went into shock.
Also, Robert F. Kennedy, his brother was killed, but John Kennedy was the first one where this assassination situation was going on with politicians, and it was carried on the mainstream media on TV. And we actually saw Oswald being murdered on TV by Ruby.
Mostly I remember when President Kennedy was assassinated, I knew exactly what I was doing. Riding in the car, we stopped in a little deli and everyone was crying. And they told us he had been shot by the time we got home. And I'm crying now just thinking about it. It was major effect on everyone.
It's a good guy. A good guy.
All of those, and then Robert Kennedy, and there was a lot of there were a lot of really political assassinations that went on in this country, which I think for most of us we thought that happens someplace else. That happens in this. That doesn't happen here, and there were a lot of them in a very short period of time, and I think it changed. I think it changed the mindset of Americans in general, who felt somehow safe from all of that. We felt protected, like, as I said, this doesn't happen here. And
About Martin Luther King's assassination, what was that like?
That was also a traumatic event. He was standing out on a motel balcony, and he was shot. That was covered on the newscast 24/7 for days after days.
But I do remember watching some of it, and it seemed unreal. For some reason, we had little TVs. They weren't sort of big, HD kind of TVs, and it did look fake. But it seemed pretty extraordinary as well. But there was also a part of me, I thought, I've always thought of the moon as being such a mysterious, faraway thing, and the idea that people are, that was sort of be the thing you couldn't attain, and so the idea that people were actually there was pretty remarkable. But I also remember very proud about that, and thinking, Americans tend to be very sort of like jingoistic, but yes, we're the first and the first.
I do obviously remember the moon landing. It was in the summer, in July, I believe, in 1969. Perhaps a little bit of a juxtaposition to some of the other things that are occurring in the summer of 1969. It's just, fascinating. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins was up in the lunar module circling the moon while those two guys went down. Great pride in what America could do. It was President Kennedy who made the threw down the gauntlet and said that we could and should, go to the moon within a decade, and we did. We fulfilled that promise, and great pride for the country. I think nuclear threat was more. The threat of nuclear war was more prevalent in the 60s. Again, as a child in grade school, we did constant drills. Get under your desk in the event of a nuclear war. Like that was going to do a lot of good, getting under our desks. But the Cold War was sort of on with Russia. They were the big threat, and there was a lot of, I think, concern during the era.
I mean, we did always worry about Russia and the Cold War and them dropping an atomic bomb on us, but I just figured the president and the Pentagon and all would take care of it and protect us.
Yeah, me too.
So
I
we
hope
did.
So I was at Juilliard, and for whatever crazy way they measure it, I was at the bottom third of my class in the academic part of it, not the music part, and that was the law. The lower third had to be involved in the draft, so I got called up to take my Army or whatever it is physical, and I had to go to Brooklyn. So the night, so I thought to myself, I'm getting out of this no matter what. Okay.
Television, yeah, that's a big one. A couple things come to mind. Certainly, the dawn of sports television and the number of events. I remember some of the early Super Bowls and college football, college basketball. Starting in this era, and I think that had tremendous effects. Some of the television, I think, followed some of the societal norms and things like shows like Laugh-In that were started back in the 60s, the Smothers Brothers, sort of bringing some of that kind of entertainment into our homes, the Beatles. And then the other thing I think is sort of the homogenation of society. I think started to erode some of the regional differences in dialect and what have you. But by all of us watching the same shows week in and week out, it sort of accelerated some of the blending.
The advent of TV, which kept growing in the 60s. People were spent a lot more time looking at TV. A lot, and the women in particular were able to get better pay, better jobs in corporations. It was a very polarizing time. There was a lot of people that did not accept that. They felt that segregation was the way to go, and they tried to integrate. A lot of them were against it. So there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of riots and so forth.
For both women and African Americans have certainly changed our social norms for the better. I think women have made tremendous strides in the workforce, for example. In terms of African Americans, again, I think tremendous progress. You can point to the fact that we have a black president, and for the first time in this country, and may well soon have our first woman president, and which points to the progress from where we were in the 1960s.
And my grandfather was very involved with Dr. King in that movement. And I remember being very proud of him because he was, I'm not sure exactly how old he was at that. It was 1964, I believe, the March in Washington. And that he actually was there and went and participated and saw Dr. King's speech. And it was a very my grandfather had retired at that point, and he was living in New Jersey. And he was in a part of New Jersey where they had a big Methodist university there. And Drew University it was called. And so he went with a busload of other people. But
Wow, 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 wow.